Chris Bazley is Business Development and Marketing Manager for Antenna International. And actually, it is very much up to Antenna a little bit, and to a person I know quite well, Rosemary Wirth-Müller, who is here as well in the audience, to come up with a suggestion like this topic. Because 3 years ago, when we did the audience research seminar in Munich, she was saying, hey, there's so much out in terms of technology. Don't you want to do something with technology? So, Rosemary, I thank you quite a lot that this is a topic we use today here. And Chris is going to talk about, obviously, the, I think, 3 case studies you're giving, which will show that museums have an opportunity to increase actually visitor engagement and also grow revenue, which is quite important for museums too. Okay, Chris, please. Do you want to use?
Okay, so thank you very much, Christian. Today we're going to talk about designing the museum experience through behavioural data. I'm always the last person to speak whenever I address conferences like this. And it's made even worse by the fact that for those of you that don't know Berlin, the cake in the restaurant here is among the best cake you can get in Berlin. So I'm going to make this 23 minutes and not 25 minutes so you can have it. Okay, so when we talk about behavioural data, there's 3 different forms that we can talk about right now. There's institutional. So what are organizations, what are museums feel or believe as institutions? This is what we believe. Then there's sort of anecdotal behavioral data. This museum is boring. And then we've got what we could say quantifiable data. So we did a survey and this is what we found. And why is all of this important? Why do we look at all of this? Because the one question that we really want to know is, what exactly do visitors do on your site? Okay, so that's where we're going for. First of all, who is Antenna? Antenna is the world's leading provider of handheld interpretation in the global cultural arena. So audio tours, multimedia tours, tablets, group tours. And each year, about 63 million people take one of our experiences at 550 of the leading cultural attractions of the world. We function through about 1,100 sites through those 550 clients. We've got 3 core areas that we specialize in. We create about 1,000 hours worth of new content each year. We own and run about 120,000 devices, and we also operate a sort of full service staffing solution as well on site. Here you can see some of our clients, ranging from the Taj Mahal to the Neues Palais here in Potsdam. The biggest museum clients that we have include Tate, who are here today, the Louvre, MoMA, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Okay. The 4 sort of areas that we're quite interested in at the moment as a company is, in terms of mobile, and when I say mobile, I'm really talking about handheld interpretation. We're seeing an increase in the investment both this way and this way in terms of where that's going. So geographically, big new regions, big new museums in regions like the Gulf, Latin America, Asia, but also vertically as well. Even the smallest museum is looking at mobile interpretation. The number 1 reason why museums invest in mobile is to increase engagement between their visitors and their permanent collection. It's not necessarily about marketing. It's not necessarily about retail. Most of that investment is not going in the traditional audio guide. It's going in multimedia. We're actually seeing a decline in audio only. Visitors are using their smartphones. But they're not necessarily downloading the app. And we're very excited about this massive demographic change in international visitation. The growth of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, SLAMM, Sri Lanka, Argentina, Mexico, and Malaysia, and the Arab world, and what this means for the roles of museums. And I thought it was really interesting what John was saying this morning about how museums are essentially Western socio-cultural concepts. and how do museums have to change and adapt for these changing audiences. Okay, so we looked at the three different forms of behavioral data. Let's start off with institutional. This is what we believe. And you could sort of, I think, epitomize this is what we believe with this famous image. 2005, Pope Benedict being announced in St. Peter's Square. 2013, Pope Francis. And in many ways, this case study is perhaps not an example of how we use behavioral data necessarily in the best way. Most of you know these kind of studies that are out. We as a business make it our business to keep abreast and on top of as many different studies that are out there. The one on the right from Loic Talon, which is the pocket-proof one, comes out each year. The annual one that Fusion Analytics do with the American Alliance of Museums and the Museums Association in the UK, and of course the Europeana one. These are really, really good surveys, and if you don't know them, you should do. But we've summarized it for you. One of the sort of starting points that we look at here, and sort of this is the key things that we see. Whether or not we like it, 65% of visitors to most cultural sites are 50 plus. They're responsible for 40% of all long-haul trips. They're the people who have the money to spend on the big foreign holidays. And yet the largest single age group of visitors is actually the typical youthful traveler, the interrailer. As I said earlier on, BRICS continue to rise in numbers. However, what I find really interesting is that last point there, is that very few people identify themselves as cultural tourists. And you've got some nice statistics there about how, people go on holiday, they will go to the museum, they come to Berlin, they go to see the Pergamon. They don't necessarily associate themselves as being cultural tourists. And I think that's very important. Leading on from that is if we look at where the investment in new media is going, you can see there is a massive growth in new mobile. About a third of all cultural institutions now offer what we call a multi-platform experience. So that's an experience on an audio tour, an experience on a multimedia tour, a smartphone app. And I think that also has to be put into a more traditional context as well. We've always called it the sort of interpretation smorgasbord, where you have a choice of a paper map or a guided tour, a docent tour. iOS and Apple dominate the museum world much more than they do the real world. And there's a 200% growth in iPad tours and 800% growth in QR codes. 30% of museums in the UK and the US are now offering some kind of QR code experience, and a decline of audio tours only. And yet, I just want to put that up there. So if you look back at this sort of assumes that the audiences that we're targeting are reasonably internet savvy, are comfortable in navigating between various different forms of media. This comes from Instagram. We just did a quick Instagram search of different people using our experiences. And one of the things that you can see is that everybody is different. There's no such thing as a typical visitor. But these are not people who see themselves as cultural tourists. These are not people who see themselves as art aficionados. And many of them are not particularly tech savvy. And I was just thinking of something that Linda raised just now, which is, there's an awful amount of data and audience analysis that sits on shelves and that's ignored. And when I look at a lot of this investment here, I wonder just how much of it is really used by your typical museum visitor. There's little evidence that a lot of the investment that's going into mobile interpretation at the moment is working. Whether we like it or not, and Loic Talon, for those of you that know him, he has a wonderful presentation where he has a picture of this is who we would like our museum visitors to be, and they're hipsters, and then this is who our museum visitors really are, and it's people like this, normal people. There's no evidence at all, and after this, if you do have evidence, please do let us know that anyone using this media is corresponding to any of the investment that's happening, particularly in things like QR codes. We don't see a corresponding uprise. And there's a very, very good study that came out towards the end of last year from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was done by Fusion Analytics and Frankly Green and Webb. And yes, 60% of all visitors owned a smartphone, and more than 60% owned a smartphone, and 60% actually used their smartphone. They accessed the wireless when they were in the museum, but they went straight to Google. And if you go to somewhere like MoMA and you just watch how people are using their devices, they're using their tablets, they're using their smartphones, but they're going straight to Google. And one of the big challenges that we see right now is that all of this investment that we're making in apps, in downloadable experiences, right now, I don't know of a single museum that is getting more than 2% of their entire visitors accessing the app for information and interpretation on their permanent collection. And we see that as well with our own data. Okay, so that goes from the sort of institutional view, and let's move into something very different. So I'm going to go very low tech, and then we're going to ramp it up to something a bit more high tech. Let's do anecdotal. This museum is boring. This is not a boring museum, but this is a case study I want to talk to you about, which is Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace summer opening, that is what you see. You see the staterooms in Buckingham Palace for the 8 weeks that the Queen goes away. However, most of the people that go to the staterooms are not expecting that. They want to see this. They want to see where the Queen lives. And the actual experience was like this. And so the Royal Collection came to Antenna to see how we could help them, and this was based on the visitor feedback, on the visitor surveys that they had done, which basically said that people were very disappointed with the experience. It was very overcrowded. They wanted to see where the Queen lived, and instead they were being paraded through these very grand but very sterile rooms. So the solution that we did was very low tech. It's all about the content. It's all about how we layer content. And again, goes back to what we were talking about this morning with experiences and creating an emotional connection through experience, not necessarily through technology. And so what we did was in this room, when we talk about the chandeliers, we have the man who cleans the chandeliers talking about how he cleans them. We have the Queen's personal secretary talking about what happens in an investiture. And all the people who live and work in the palace bring it to life. So that's a very quick and low-tech example of how we've used visitor feedback. And what we've achieved is we've cut the visitor dwell time from 1.5 hours to 45 minutes, and we've increased visitor satisfaction to about 90%. And if you go on TripAdvisor, you can just see the kinds of comments about the introduction. But I know we're still concerned about smartphones. I know we're still concerned about high technology and about that kind of thing. So let's talk now about quantifiable stuff. And I'm going to start with Antenna. So being an audio tour company, we probably get every day people saying to us, well, why do you still have your own devices? Why don't we just throw the devices out and you just do smartphones? And our response to that was, well, that's actually a very good question. We probably need to get an answer to that. So we actually did one of the biggest visitor usage surveys ever undertaken of mobile behavior in museums over a 3-year period. There you can see some of the clients that we did that in. If we're here for 4 hours, I can share with you the deep findings, but I'll just give you an overview now. 40% of visitors, at least 40% of visitors, research the museum before they leave home. That's kind of a fact now that I would hope we all know, that the opportunity for museums to have a dialogue with visitors starts before they've even left home, okay? And there's no such thing as a typical visitor. Some people like to come and browse. Some people like to have an itinerant tour. And the majority of visitors still preferred to have the museum provide the device. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And more than 70% of people saw something that they really liked that reminded them to Google it when they got home again. If you go a bit deeper, and this is a specific museum, I can't give you the actual name of it, but you can see how that drills down. And again, it goes back to the fact that the majority of the visitors, again, are not art aficionados. They're not hipsters. They are regular tourists. That the majority preferred to use the museum's own device. But what's really interesting is, of course, there was a big difference between the under 35s and the over 35s. They wanted, their whole spectrum of what they wanted and what they expected out of the visit was totally different to people above that time. And it was all about making the experience interactive, making the experience interconnected, making the experience entertaining. But one of the things that was also really interesting was give us things to do in the time available. And it's not just a question of we'll give you 10 minutes. It's actually we'll give you a day if you give us experiences to do in that time. And of course, that's important because that's our future co-audience. And the result of that is the latest device that we've developed, which is the Iris 2, which combines both a keypad with an interactive touchscreen. We keep the keypad because it's still the most universal way to access content and DDA compliant, but it's also completely NFC, Bluetooth, and Wi-Fi enabled, so it links through to social networks. How am I doing for time, Christian? Moving on forwards, the advantage that we have now with how technology works is that we can do a lot of smart data, and this is our new smart rack. So based on how the devices are used, we can now get closer to that whole question of what exactly are the visitors doing in the space. So that's a very basic package there that you can see the different kinds of things that we can look at, and that's a very boring chart that shows how the data can come out, and that's another boring chart that shows you the kind of visitor surveys that we can do. But what I really wanted to show you was we could look at visitors by language. But this is one museum where we've taken the data from how the devices are used. And it's in Northern Europe. So these are ranked in order of efficiency. And one of the big findings that we're seeing is that you really can see different nationalities go around museums in different ways. So how long do we think, the Dutch were the longest. How long do we think the Dutch spent in this museum? And this is a large museum. It's got quite a good international reputation. It's not encyclopedic, but it has a lot of visitors. How long do you think people would have spent? 1 hour. 2 hours? Okay. About an hour. The Italians and the English, slightly less. The Germans, 45. Spanish. How long do you think the Spanish spent? Anybody from Spain here? No? Come on, guess. 30 minutes. Very good. 36 minutes. And we were asking our Spanish colleagues, why is that? And they said, because we want to see everything. We don't just want to see the museum, we've got to see everything else in that city as well. But just keep that fact in mind. And only 2% of people actually did the entire tour. So let's make this visual. I just want to show you how this works. It's not quite as good as what we've seen in the presentation beforehand. But here's one of the ground plans of this museum. So you can see that these are pictures, and they're numbered sequentially, and that sort of white box at the top is how people come in. And what's really interesting is this is, of course, where it doesn't work, isn't it? Okay, should we forget it? We'll forget it. That's fine. So maybe we can show you later on. By going online, I can show you the route that different nationalities take through the place. Don't worry, we're probably running out of time anyway. the route that different nationalities take as they go through the museum. And again, one of the big interesting things is Italians, how Italians, the pictures that Italians were interested in are completely different to the pictures that other nationalities are interested in. And the amount of time that people spent in front of paintings, the different levels, the different floors of the museum. So we're finally getting to understanding what people do inside the museum. And I'm not going to go into that one either. Some interesting observations. That's the most popular painting in the gift shop. It's only the 4th most looked at painting. Of the top five most popular artworks, only 3 of them had stuff relating to them in the gift shop. Okay, this is the second question. So we have games. We have interactive games. We all love interactive games. So who would like to tell me who they think was the most interested in playing games?
Are the games exhibits or are they
on the device? Come on. Anyone has a guess? English. Anyone, any advanced in English? It's actually Spanish. Spanish spent a total of, out of their 35 minutes, they spent 4 minutes playing games. There we go. What does this mean? Well, based on what we found out about how Spanish people are interpreting art in Northern Europe, and not just in one museum, but in the various museums that we work in, next month we open at the Frida Kahlo Museum in Mexico City. And this is very interesting and is going to be our test bed for how we look at tourists from BRICS and from developing countries and from SLAMMs. We know that they are middle class, affluent, but do they have different tastes? And so we're experimenting based on the data that we have from our other sites. And this is the app that we've developed that will be on a device. You can see it's very colorful. It's also very quick. There's lots of things to do. And there's lots and lots of highly interactive different kinds of games. So we'll let you know how that goes. And then just to, and there you can see some more games there. And being able to wade through letters and correspondence and that kind of thing. Just a few other things to finish up with. Again, learning from the app. This is at the Rijksmuseum. Christian identified the Rijksmuseum this morning, and he's very right to do that. I think was certainly for me the most important new museum opening for last year, and what they're doing in interpretation is incredible. But the app is available for people to download onto their own devices and also on customized iTouch Generation 5s that we provide. It's a hybrid app, so it's a shell, and you stream content, and what we're seeing is the app is used in a very different way to how we use smartphones. So it's draining the batteries because it's so content heavy, and the experience is coming to an end after about an hour and a half. People spend, 4 to 5 hours in the Rijksmuseum, so that's a key learning. Talking statues, comparing QR codes, I said earlier on, there's not really a lot to prove that, we're seeing a lot of value for money in QR. We actually have a lot more hope in NFC. But actually funded by the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, along with Sing London, we're doing an investigation into how, first of all, how effective cultural organizations are getting their message out of the walls and into the city by talking statues. And looking at how we can engage wider groups. This is a project I've been very closely involved in, which is, again, it's this translation of a Western concept like a museum into the Middle East. And when we started working at the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, there wasn't even general agreement about what the Arabic word for curator is. But also, how do we encourage local audiences to come into this museum? And if we could encourage them to come into the Grand Mosque, then when they come to places like Munich, when they come to London, Paris during the summer, can we use the same techniques to try to engage them in coming to the museums there? And finally, the Peak in Hong Kong, we opened a few months ago. Again, it's looking at how Asian audiences interact with devices in a cultural setting. These are all projects that have begun or in the process of beginning in the current 6-month process. And when we do the conference next year, I'll be able to share with you the results of how that's happened. And just to finish up with, those are our visitors. And it's been really nice to see in pretty much every presentation that's been going through this today that we all realize that, well, people in this room realize that these are the people who it's all about. And I think that the big challenge that we all have as the sort of advocates for that is to really make sure that this message gets through in the wider museum community. And that's the summary. Get to know your visitors, and if you don't know your visitors, get to know your visitors, and then find out how to interact with your site, and think about how you can engage with them specifically. And don't forget, no such thing as a typical visitor. Thank you.